Welcome back to another edition of the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about political independence. The two main parties are obviously Democrats and Republicans, but recent decades have shown an increase in the number of voters that identify as independent, where they eschew both of the main parties. Alongside that has been a general rise in dissatisfaction with both the Democratic and Republican parties over the past couple decades. Gallup polling results have recently said 58% of respondents said a third party is needed to do an adequate job of representing the American people. Now, some of you watching this may have such a bill of gripes, but whether you are Democrat, Republican, Independent, or whatever the case may be, there is a lot that's misunderstood about independents, who they are, what they think, why they think the way they do, how they behave in elections, and so on. That's a large part of why I wrote my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive. One such misunderstanding, which I discuss in Chapter 2, is what really is an independent? For today's podcast, we explore that question. How do we define an independent? How do different states define independence in voter registration? How many independents are there in the United States? And so on. So, let's get into it. First of all, basic definition of an independent. It's one of those questions that seems quite straightforward, but it really isn't. You can ask 5 different people what being an independent is, and they can give you 5 totally different answers. Does the definition include third parties? So libertarian, green, constitution. So we're just saying, are they just independent of the two main parties? So they're just not Democrat or Republican. Does an independent mean that they don't have a party at all? So we're not even a third party. We are exclusively no party whatsoever. Do we say that? What about people who call themselves independent Democrats or independent Republicans, as there have sometimes been throughout U.S. election history? You go back into congressional election history from decades past, every once in a while you see people that identify as independent Democrats or independent Republicans. It was also Minnesota that for a time, the Republican Party briefly changed their name to Independent Republicans. Well, not briefly. It was for, well, maybe like something like 20 years. But what about them? Do they count as independents? Also, there are some third parties that are named some variation of independent party or independence party. And sometimes voters will register with those parties mistakenly when they're just trying to register as no party at all. They just see the independent and think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to register as. But really, they were just trying to find no party whatsoever. You also got to remember that there's a difference between independent, and moderate. It is a difference because one refers to partisanship and one refers to ideology. Talked before in the past about how Republicans, yes, typically are conservative, but they're not always conservative, and not every conservative is a Republican. Democrats, Democrat and liberal is not the exact same thing, although they're very correlated. It's a similar thing with independents. Not all of them are moderate. In fact, for some of them, their voting history and their views on political issues actually indicates they sometimes lean more heavily to either the Democratic or Republican side than an actual Democrat or Republican is actually towards that side. And people also have varying reasons for why they identify as an independent. Maybe they really are independent. Maybe they are super middle of the road, very centrist. They don't know what exactly the two parties are really about, so they just go as an independent just because it's just easier for them to do that. It could be a disaffected Democrat or Republican that thinks their quote-unquote normal party, the one that you would typically expect a conservative or a liberal to identify with, is too far to their side. Maybe they think Republicans are too far to the right, or that Democrats are too far to the left, even though they would normally side with one of those parties. Or they think their side is not far enough to their side of the spectrum. Maybe they actually think that Republicans are not far enough to the right, or they think that Democrats are not far enough to the left. And candidates specifically might go independent because they couldn't win their party's primary for whatever office they were running for. You see that, maybe not frequently, but you see it a decent amount every so often. So all sorts of things to account for when you're talking about how we define an independent, not just for voters, but for people who run for office, people who win an elected office, people who campaign, all sorts of factors that go into it. So there's really not a clear-cut, okay, this is what an independent is, because it means different things to different people, just like being a Republican means different things to different Republicans sometimes, or being a Democrat means different things to some Democrats versus others. We have a tendency to think that words in politics have a specific meaning when sometimes they don't. Or some people try to tell you that it should be a specific meaning that they support, while others might not support that meaning themselves. But now, how does each state define independent? We're talking about states that register voters by party affiliation. In the previous episode, I mentioned that there are currently 30 states that track voters' party affiliation. The other states just register voters, and then that's it. They're just registered. Obviously, in reality, they are typically Democrat or Republican or independent, but they're just not officially registered as one when they register to vote. And all the states that do register voters by party affiliation, they all have at least one designation for being what we would consider independent. For non-party voters, different labels for people of no party. For the most part, they mean the same thing, but there are a couple of exceptions. So Alaska has nonpartisan, which means you registered and you said you have no party, or that you're not of any party. And then there's also undeclared, which basically just means I'm registered to vote. I'm not going to tell you who I'm affiliated with. I'm not even going to say that I'm not affiliated with a party. I'm just registered and that's it. So they don't take that extra step of declaring themselves as nonpartisan. They're just registered. California uses unknown and other. Iowa says no party. Kansas, unaffiliated. Massachusetts, unenrolled. And then South Dakota uses independent. And several other states use one or more of those designations themselves. Those are just a few examples of names that you see for people that are not affiliated with a party. There's also NPA in Florida, no party affiliation. There's a short, or the abbreviation for no party affiliate. And then for third parties, that if we consider third parties as also independent, it depends on each state's requirements for the formation of third parties. The level of support among voters for that party's formation to become ballot qualified. Ballot qualification means that you can list candidates on the ballot under that party affiliation. So if the Libertarian Party is ballot qualified, it's the most common third party that you see. That means candidates can be listed as libertarians on the ballot. Otherwise, they got to be a write-in, or they got to be a party that is ballot qualified. Now, states' laws requirements could be simply filling a petition to become an organized party. They might have to reach a certain threshold of registered voters that say, I am this party. They might need a certain level of support in elections, or several other possibilities that there can be. And parties can also gain or lose ballot qualification status. Democrats or Republicans are the only ones that appear in all 50 states and D.C. Even in states where the Democratic Party or the Republican Party are very weak, they are ballot qualified. Democrats in Wyoming, they exist. Republicans in Hawaii, they exist. And then you also have, alluded to earlier, some form of ballot qualified independent party or independent party in some states. They have some variation of that name. And you can find those in states such as Connecticut, Florida, Louisiana, Minnesota. And again, at least a few of those voters mistakenly believed they had to register as that party to be considered not with a party. Think about how we define an independent and what being an independent actually is. Now, how many people are registered as independents? Since not every state registers voters by party affiliation, and the ones that do sometimes only make public updates of registration counts intermittently, we can't know the exact number of independents at a given time, or Democrats or Republicans for that matter. So whatever body, government body handles voter registration numbers, be they a county level election administrator or supervisor of elections or the secretary of state for a state, they don't necessarily update every single day. So there's some that do, but some of them might only update every month or every single major election that happens. And so they might only update for primaries and generals instead of throughout the months. It really just depends on where you go. So you can't just go at one point. There's no way to have a repository where you say, okay, this is the exact number of Republicans, Democrats, and independents that are registered at this moment in time. You can't do that. You can get as close as you possibly can, but it's never going to be 100% accurate. But you can at least look at registration numbers for the states that do track party affiliation, even though they're unlikely to be representative of the whole country. Several weeks ago or so on this podcast, I talked about how party registration numbers had shifted for some states from the 2020 to the 2024 presidential election. Though because of differences in how often states publicly update their numbers, don't know exactly how many voters were eligible to vote in the 2024 election, even though those states do track party affiliation, because again, they only intermittently update those numbers. But the number of independents based on voter registration around the 2024 election, I try to get as close as I can based on what seemed to be the most close to numbers for the date of the election. And keep in mind that these numbers are combining both non-party and third-party voters. So that's the definition I'm using here. Though third-party voters make up only a small percentage of these independents. The vast majority of them are going to actually be no party or unaffiliated or whatever that state uses to indicate that somebody is an independent. So states that had a plurality of independent voters in the 2024 election, there were 9 of those. That was Connecticut, Iowa, barely, Maine, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, Oregon, and Rhode Island. And then there was a majority of independent voters in Alaska, Colorado, and Massachusetts. So those were 3 states. Other states where there are more independents than Democrats, but not more than Republicans. We had 6 states that fit that bill: Arizona, Idaho, Kansas, South Dakota, Utah, and West Virginia. West Virginia! And states where there were more independents than Republicans, but not more than Democrats, were in California, Delaware, and New York. So there were 3 of those states. And then some states where independents actually made the smallest proportion. So they were a smaller proportion than both the Democratic and Republican parties: Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Wyoming. And again, that's just for the states that actually track their voters' party affiliation. We can't really say for sure how many independents are in other states. You might look at public polling data, but again, that's not a fully exact percentage, or those are not fully exact stats on the number of independents in those states. But speaking of that public polling data on independents, polling organizations such as Gallup track party affiliation of citizens. They survey them and ask them, what they identify as. And Gallup's poll is probably the most well-known one. They need to do this in part because, like we said before, not every state tracks party affiliation. So they try to gauge the country at large, how the percentage of people that identify as Democrat or independent or Republican. And political campaigns also do it to measure the divide in party affiliations in their electorate they are appealing to so that they can craft campaign strategies and tactics. But going back to Gallup, annual numbers here, and they've been measuring this since 1988. There's also quarterly measurements, but for this exercise, just going to go by what the yearly trends Gallup said they were for both for Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So the specific question in the poll was, in politics, as of today, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? Now, in polling, question wording is vitally important because it can just changing one or two words can completely shift how that poll's results show. And you also got to be careful of trying to tweak that question over time because it can change the results, even if you make a little bit of a difference in how you word it. For example, in politics, as of today, maybe somebody is just like one day they're very sick of their party and they say, you know what, I'm an independent, even though they technically didn't actually change their registration. So just little things to keep in mind. Not saying that the wording of this question is wrong. It's just something to keep in mind. And also saying, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? That's not specifically measuring third parties. So you would assume that in this case, third parties are considered independent. Independents in the Gallup poll have almost always been a higher percentage than both Democrats and Republicans. And they've in each year have at least been tied with the lower percentage of the two main parties. So maybe it's not as much as Democrats in one year, but it's tied with Republicans. In another year, it might be not as much as Republicans, but it might be tied with Democrats. And specifically from 2009 to 2024, independents have been at least 37% each year and 43% specifically in 2023 and 2024. However, Gallup also asks a follow-up to the party ID question. If independent, other party, unsure, or no answer, as of today, do you lean more to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? So this is where you get a lot of independents who say they are, or we call them, they don't necessarily say it themselves, but in the biz, we call them Democratic leaners or Republican leaners. And the Gallup numbers for that from 2014 to 2024, initially consistent showing of more Democratic leaners than Republican leaners. But since the end of 2022, it's been much more often more Republican leaners than Democratic leaners. More Republican leaners than Democratic leaners in 7 of the last 9 quarters of the year, including quarter 4 of 2024. But not necessarily a huge difference between the two. So it's not a lot of independents that are specifically saying, nope, I'm not even going to say that I'm leaning one way or the other. But you're also going by, what exactly these people recall, and if they lean towards Democratic or Republican Party, how often do they lean towards Republican or Democratic Party? Again, some independents actually vote more like a Republican or Democrat than some Democrats or Republicans do, but of course, that's not always the case. As for famous independent candidacies in U.S. history, for this section, independent is going to be considered non-party and third party. And I'm just going to highlight some of these because I want to demonstrate the range of what an independent can be depending on who you ask. We have maybe the most famous, yeah, well, maybe not one of definitely one of the most famous, maybe not the most famous third-party candidacy actually comes from a person who previously was president, Teddy Roosevelt. He was the Republican president from 1901 to 1909, and he really tutored, mentored William Taft as his protege, and Taft was supposed to basically carry the torch for Roosevelt's agenda, and he won in 1908. However, Roosevelt was very dissatisfied with Taft's record and felt he did not carry on his own legacy well enough, and so he ran as the progressive candidate, sometimes nicknamed the Bull Moose candidate. And so he took a lot of would-be Taft voters away from William Taft, and he split the vote to the point where Democrat Woodrow Wilson won pretty handily. Teddy Roosevelt actually got more electoral votes than William Taft did. He won 88 electoral votes, and he won 27.4% of the popular vote. So it's hard to say for certain, but had it not been for Roosevelt's third-party bid, William Taft might have won re-election, and who knows, maybe Woodrow Wilson never becomes president later on. Probably the most famous third-party or independent candidacy, third-party or no party, that's probably Ross Perot, particularly his 1992 election campaign. He was a quirky Texas billionaire who made a lot of waves in that election. And Perot's views, we had Teddy Roosevelt here, who was a Republican president. Perot's views on issues included both typically conservative and typically liberal stances. For example, he was pro-choice regarding abortion, but he also supported the death penalty. So on the abortion side, typically a liberal stance, but on the death penalty, typically a conservative stance. He did not capture a single electoral vote. His vote was too diffused amongst the populace, but he did receive 18.9% of the popular vote. Now, did he swing the election one way or the other? Can't really be sure, because he really pulled a lot of both would-be George H.W. Bush votes, who was the incumbent in that election, and also some votes that would have been for Democrat Bill Clinton, who did go on to win the 1992 election and then would win re-election in 1996. But Ross Perot's popular vote percentage was the highest for a third-party or no-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt. So sort of a callback to that candidacy. And then the last couple examples are going to be actually U.S. senators. So we have Bernie Sanders and Angus King, who are current U.S. senators, Bernie Sanders being for Vermont and Angus King being for Maine. And both caucus with Democrats and definitely lean more to that side, especially Bernie Sanders. And Sanders had, in fact, he did run for the 2016 Democratic nomination for U.S. president. Sanders used to be the mayor of Burlington, Vermont in the 1980s, when you started to notice that real shift from Vermont being a more Republican state towards a more Democratic state. And he was also a longtime member of the U.S. House prior to being in the U.S. Senate, and he's been in the U.S. Senate since 2007. Angus King, meanwhile, he was the governor of Maine from 1995 to 2003, then eventually ran for U.S. Senate and won in 2013. He won in 2012, started serving in 2013, and so he's been in the chamber ever since as well. And this really just goes, all of these examples, Teddy Roosevelt, Ross Perot, Bernie Sanders, and Angus King, just really goes to show how independents can run just a whole spectrum of independents in terms of parties they affiliate with or have affiliated with in the past and their ideologies. So you ask each one of those guys, well, you can't ask Teddy Roosevelt or Ross Perot now because they've passed, but if you were able to ask all of them, all four of those guys, what being an independent is, probably get four different answers, much like you could with 4 random independent voters might get 4 different answers too. So that's just to give you an idea of just how different how difficult it can be to truly define what an independent is. When you have a Democrat and you have a Republican, yes, there's differences, but within the Republican Party and differences within the Democratic Party. We had an episode about that, but you get a general sense of what they're about because of that party label. Because independence, the label is rather nebulous, it's really hard to inherently get a sense of what that candidate is about. So just some things to keep in mind. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to what an independent is, but yeah, it is something to keep in mind, just how difficult it can be to define it. But that's it for the main topic of the podcast. We've got another random fact of the day for you. And that random fact of the day is, did you know that U.S. senators and some states' governors were previously chosen by state legislatures? So it's a little more well known that U.S. senators were once chosen by state legislatures. Originally, the framers of the Constitution had set it up so that U.S. senators were appointed by the state legislatures. And that was until the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, changing it so that U.S. senators were chosen by popular vote, similarly to the U.S. House. It was one of a couple of U.S. constitutional amendments that passed during the Progressive Era in U.S. history, which was a time of major economic and political reforms as well. But the term lengths for U.S. senators stayed at 6 years. Now, for governors, this is much lesser known that some governors also were once chosen by state legislatures. Not every state did it. In fact, only a few actually did that. There were, in fact, 7 states that used this method at some point in time. You had Delaware prior to 1792, Louisiana before 1845, Maryland before 1838, New Jersey before 1844, North Carolina before 1836, South Carolina before 1865, and Virginia before 1851. So it had died out. The practice had died out to have governors appointed by state legislatures by the mid-1860s. And Kentucky governors in 1792 and 1796 were also not elected by popular vote, but they were elected through a specially elected body of electors instead of the state legislature. So they were a different system than even those states were. So just interesting little tidbits here and there. So when you look back at U.S. election history, there's some kind of wacky, compared to today, some really wacky methods of just political administration in general, but nonetheless fascinating. So that is going to do it for today's podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share these episodes with people you know. Links in the show notes. I have my Facebook, my LinkedIn, my book, which I had just referenced earlier, and there's a huge reason why I even did this episode. Just gives you a taste of what's to come in the book. It's available on Amazon in ebook and paperback format. Why independents rarely win elections and how they could become more competitive, and several other links in the show notes as well. So, as always, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, take care.